Hello and welcome back to Miss Hannah Loves Grammar. In this video I'm going to be concentrating on Holy Thursday from Songs of Innocence by William Blake. Before I go any further, I'd really like to encourage you to like and subscribe, and please comment below on what your thoughts are on this poetic work. So William Blake was born in 1757 and died in 1827. But if we're truly honest with ourselves, his poetic works were best appreciated centuries after he died. He is today considered a key figure to the Romantic movement. He held incredibly progressive ideas on love and equality at the time. He hated the notion of slavery, which was controversial in his lifetime. And he was greatly influenced by the ideals of the American Civil War and supported the French Revolution. So ultimately he had some big challenges around authoritarianism that was kicking in from either the monarchy, the military, or the idea that somebody who was rich should control the poor. He was incredibly critical, as I say, of institutions that held power over the individual, and was incredibly cynical about the rise of industrialisation, especially the Industrial Revolution that he was seeing in his very own city of London. He deeply rejected religiosity, so seeming holy, but did not reject God, so much so that as a child and later as an adult he believed he saw angels on multiple occasions and wrote about it. This particular poem, Holy Thursday, originally arrived in a collection of 26 engraved and illustrated works by Blake in the collection called Songs of Innocence in 1789. It's important to note that as an engraver and a painter, this was how Blake chose to create his works. But 5 years later, he bound these poems with another collection called Songs of Innocence and Experience. And it's interesting to note that Blake has another poem by the same name that I will refer to as Songs of Experience, Holy Thursday. But I want us to delve a little into what the words innocence and experience really show us with the rebranding of a collection in 1794, because it does shed a little light on Blake's vision here. Innocence, to me, implies connotations of purity and, dare I say it, childhood, with adulthood polluting us with experience. So if you like, innocence is the ideal of what we hope humanity could be like, and experience is how the world corrupts us. This is a fascinating collection, but as I get into the nuts and bolts of this poem, I think it's important also for you to get a visual gaze of exactly what his works first looked like. A real hallmark of just how creative Blake is, shown to us in this visual beauty of the illustration that marries up perfectly with the language that he's about to share with us as we read this poem in a moment. I love that the blue in the background mirrors the sense of innocence of these children, who are side by side in their blue and red and green, as we are told in the poem. But equally there's an already sinister sense that they're being led, guided by quite stern figures. Either in the top right we have almost emperor-like characters holding sceptres as they walk towards the church, and at the bottom on the left we have a member of the clergy who seems sinister just by the very nature of wearing black. Even though that is the traditional garb, it somehow seems more sinister against such a merry and jolly light background. But we get a real flavour of how much passion is exuded in his messaging through the fact that he created artwork to go with his poetic works. It really signals how much a labour of love this was for Blake. So let's delve into the title. It's called Holy Thursday, and on the face of it, you might be thinking, well, what's so holy about Thursday? Well, actually, this title is not some sort of weird oxymoronic message. It's referring to Ascension Day, which Christians believe 40 days after Jesus rose from the dead and was resurrected, he ascended to heaven. So it's marking that day. And in Blake's time, there was an annual service at St Paul's Cathedral for poor children of London charity schools. they were meant to go and give thanks to God for the blessing of their education. Now, this is quite awkward because the quality of their education in a London charity school at this time would have probably been, first and foremost, learning a trade, probably working in many of the industrialised workplaces that were set up and used child labour. So it's a fascinating, awkward grittiness to see innocence through that event, which we're forced to do in this particular poem. There's a stark simplicity that he draws out of the tensions that are placed on the vulnerable by those in power. I like the fact this is called Holy Thursday because that is obviously how it would have been sold. But also, it pushes us to critique how much space there is for these children to have a spiritual encounter on what Christians would deem is a holy day. There's something macabre in the background. Let's see as we read it now. 'Twas on a holy Thursday, their innocent faces clean, the children walking two and two in red and blue and green. Grey-headed beadles walked before with ones as white as snow, till into the high dome of Paul's they like Thames water flow. Oh, what a multitude they seemed, these flowers of London town. Seated in companies they sit with radiance all their own. The hum of multitudes was there, but multitudes of lambs. Thousands of little boys and girls raising their innocent hands. Now like a mighty wind they raise to heaven the voice of song, or like harmonious thunderings the seats of heaven among. Beneath them sit the aged men, wise guardians of the poor. Then cherish pity, lest you drive an angel from your door. As you can see, this poem is made up of 3 stanzas, and it forms 2 rhymed couplets within each of those stanzas, and a rhyme scheme of AA, BB. That helps mirror for us the 2 very different dynamics that we trace across this poem. Of the authority figures, the beadles that are grey-headed and leading these children, and obviously the children and their innocence. It's also important to note that in contrast to the collection, this particular poem has longer lines than the others. And I suspect that's because it's mirroring that these children are going on a procession, so each of the lines could graphologically be showing us that. I think it's interesting to consider that the lyrical rhythm mirrors the fact that these children are innocent. It heightens the contrast between them and the depiction of their exploitation, as I suggested earlier. It's also interesting to acknowledge that the lyrical voice of this poem seems omnipotent, an observer from afar, as if God looking down on fallen mankind. As we delve into the poem itself, "'Twas on a holy Thursday, their innocent faces clean." The implication of their innocent faces now being clean is that their faces are often dirty. As an echo of what I've already suggested about the rhythm of this poem, we get a sense that these children are plodding to the beat, with every iambic beat of da-dum. It seems like they're plodding. Let me draw that out in line 2. The children walking 2 and 2 in red and blue and green. It's iambic heptameter, I believe, 14 beats per line in this poem. But we get a real sense of the tension between these children who are in their best clothes, it would seem their bright coloured clothes, yet there's an almost military precision to their plodding along. They're constrained, it would seem. Now, line 3 introduces us to the authority figures, who seem quite evil, actually. They're grey-headed, which doesn't automatically assume something sinister, but the description of the beadle, the authority leader, as having a wand as white as snow, implies something cool in their character. And, the question we have to ask ourselves again and again across this poem is, are these children being led and nurtured as lambs, as they'll later be referred to, or are they lambs to the slaughter? I think it's the awkwardness of the similes that we encounter in stanza 1 that help fuel our sense of concern for these small children. The ones that these men are wielding are as white as snow. It once more implies that they aren't to be trusted somehow. But equally, like Thames waters flow, these children are moving on. Now, it's not quite in the lifetime of Blake, but the Thames is polluted even in his times because of industrialisation. So they're flowing like Thames waters flowing. But are they being corrupted by the fact they're being led in this way? Is it their innocence that's carrying them thus far, and are they about to be corrupted in some way? Now, as we move on to stanza 2, we're struck by imagery of nature. It's the multitude of flowers of London town. These children are a symbol of hope and life, and of course, as a romantic, Blake loves nature. But they're a symbol here of flowers that are fragile, beautiful, like any plants that could survive the harsh landscape of polluted London. And these children in line 6, they're seated in companies and they sit with radiance all their own. They radiate light because of their innocence, it would seem. They have a relationship, it would seem, with something spiritual, like God himself. And actually that kind of fuels what Christians believe, that relationship with Christ, who had the desire that all the little children should come to him. And yet we've also got the repetition of multitude across this stanza 3 times. They're a multitude of beauty. They're a multitude of lovely sound. They're a multitude of innocence in the lamb. Again, a very intentional reference. They're a force for good. They are uncorrupted. Thousands of little boys and girls raising their innocent hands. The fact it's their hands that are now the thing that's innocent, no longer their faces, but now their hands. Their actions are going to be what they do with their hands. Even though they are not the powerful ones, they are doing everything they can to give their glory to God. Now, as we move to stanza 3, this is where the power shift changes in this poem. It makes sense that someone like Blake would shape the power shift because, after all, he's massively against authority. There's a mighty wind as they raise their voices to heaven, and it's a voice of song, like harmonious thunderings. These children singing, no, they don't seem so fragile. The similes show this divine communication with God that I referenced earlier. And the authority is now beneath them, as you can see in the penultimate line of this poem, because these children are spiritually connected. I think it's so intense and cacophonous, this particular stanza. You've got the imagery of nature. You've got the mighty wind, the power of that adjective, mighty, before wind. You've got harmonious thunderings, also acknowledging that these children, their every sound seems beautiful to God. And the power of their song seems very moving. The repetition of heaven, aligned with so much natural imagery, suggests that these children are connected with the natural beauty that God created. So, all in all, whilst every stanza has its own pertinent message about what the children are experiencing as they walk, as they sit with God, as they sing with all their heart out, connecting to God, the final line is instructing us. Blake's omnipotent poetic voice is clear. Cherish pity, lest you drive an angel from your door. It's really quite damning of the Beatles, because they're now these aged wise men, the guardians of the poor, but it's almost implying, quite explicitly I would say actually, they have missed an opportunity. They have not connected with God as they should because they've been so focused on ritual. God wants us to love the vulnerable is what's coming out in this final line. Blake feels, or the poetic voice feels, that we all have a responsibility to avoid failing God's expectations of us. The power and purpose of this poem very much fixes our focus on another aspect of the children and their goodness. Yet we can't help but notice the uncomfortable nature, the awkward, clunky disconnect between the spiritual and the mundane that the grey-headed beadles, with their wands as white as snow, seem enchanted with. I suspect the questions that we need to have as readers today of this poem need to focus more on Blake's intentions then. Was this an attack purely on authority, or was it also just a celebration of our rawest need to be free? Because at the best moments of this poem, we see the glimmerings of these children stepping beyond, being freer in their hearts and their souls when they're singing, in a way that when they're proceeding to the church, there's not freedom really at all because they're under the control of the Beatles. And is this romantic, as we call him now, really suggesting that the best kind of opportunity for a child is true freedom? And it makes sense. I suggest that wherever you sit on whether Blake's a crazy madman or a creative who was only appreciated after he died because his work was too random, to just acknowledge that there is some beauty in this masterpiece, partly because of the simplicity of it, but also partly because of the clear contrast that we then get to unpack again with Holy Thursday Songs of Experience. Why not subscribe to Miss Hannah Loves Grammar for all things English, literary and grammatical?